All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Kate Good from the Parish Resource Center, and thank you so much for joining us this morning for this pastor's breakfast that we are eating breakfast in all of our different locations or already have. Just a couple of housekeeping notes, and then I will turn this over to Larry Gingrich of Landis Communities, but please make sure you're muted unless you are wanting the whole entire group to hear whatever is happening on your end. Also, we will be taking time for questions throughout. So if you have a question that's specific to what Nelson is speaking about, feel free to either unmute yourself and ask your question at an appropriate time, or you can also chat a question. The chat is sort of in the middle of the bottom of your screen, and you can chat a question, and I will also make sure that to ask that question. So if you have any questions about how to do any of this, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Larry.
Well, good morning. Can you hear me? Okay. All right, getting some head nods there. Well, welcome. There is a long tradition within Landis Communities of having a pastor's or clergy breakfast. Landis Communities, for those of you who aren't as connected here, is an organization providing both places to live and services wherever folks live who are age 55 and above throughout Lancaster and Lebanon County in Pennsylvania. And we are just really happy to be partnering for the last number of years with the Parish Resource Center, not only on providing content for this morning and events like this, but other events where we see our work intersecting. It has been a real big help to us to work with Kate and her team. And so we're happy to have this event that brings together an opportunity for clergy and lay leaders to have content to help in recognizing growth opportunities, but also just bringing a diverse group of people together that wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity in person. I did have one or two folks say they were disappointed we weren't actually going to send breakfast to each of your homes. But maybe when drone delivery comes in, we'll figure out a way to do that. While we miss meeting together in person, this does give us the ability to offer opportunities across a large geographic area. And so we chose to do this in this way. And we're, again, glad to have each of you here and really just honored to have Nelson Kraybill with us and give him the opportunity to talk about some of the work he has been doing and his book at this really important time, both in the church and in the country as a whole, where so many times we are siloed away with people who think, feel, and sound just like we do, and recognizing more and more in congregational and organizational settings that is not the way that we want to operate. So I'll turn it back over to Kate. She's going to do some introductions, and then we'll get to Nelson. And thank you again, all of you, for coming and participating in this. Look forward to a enriching time together.
Thank you, Larry. And we are grateful for our partnership with Landis Communities, who makes it possible for us to offer events and workshops and support congregations throughout the year. So thanks to Larry and all of the folks at Landis Communities. Just a note about how this morning will work. I am going to be interviewing Nelson about his book and the work that he's been doing. And then we will just give time for questions at the end, but also, as I mentioned earlier, please feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question that's relevant to what we're discussing. You can also chat a question, and I'll keep an eye on the chat. So please, we want this to be an interactive time, so feel very welcome to join the conversation as you have questions. It's my pleasure to introduce J. Nelson Kraybill. He was president of Mennonite World Conference from 2015 to 2022, president of the Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Indiana from 1997 to 2009, and program director of the London Mennonite Center in England from 1991 to 1996. He is the author of Apocalypse and Allegiance, Worship, Politics, and Devotion in the Book of Revelation. He is an ordained minister who served churches in England, Vermont, and Indiana. He leads peace pilgrim tours to biblical sites in the Holy Land and is currently teaching and writing in Israel and Palestine, but is at the moment in Lancaster. We're delighted to have him here. And just a note that Nelson has a new book, Stuck Together, which we will be discussing today. So this is a book that you can find on Amazon and other places that you buy books. But just so if you're wondering what we keep referring back to, it's this book. And I would encourage you to find it where you can. It's both full of wonderful stories about this conversation, about polarities, but also really concrete ways of thinking through how you can make a difference in this area. So I'm going to start with some questions, and then we'll give time for folks to also ask their questions. So Nelson, how did you get started thinking about this big topic of polarities?
Well, Kate, before I answer that question, just let me thank you for the invitation to be here. And it's wonderful to be back in Lancaster County. It's 3.5 years since I've physically been in the county. That had to do with COVID and also with my work overseas. So yesterday, I got to see my 99-year-old mother, Mary Jean, here at Landis Homes in person for the first time in several years. And seeing some more of my family. And it's just good to be back in my homeland. I was born and raised in near Elizabethtown. I know the farm was sold to Amish who just in the last year demolished the farmhouse in which I was born. So a little bit of my ancestry slipped away. But I see some familiar faces in this group today, and I'm honored to be with you. I also might add that I am staying at Landis Homes with my wife, Ellen, and right across the hall from the guest room where we stay is the apartment of David and Grace Shank. Many of you, of course, would have known David and Grace, would know them. David died, 2 months ago, something like that. And I hold David up as a model of what I'm trying to advocate happen for all Christians in how we relate to polarities. And David was a mentor to me for a number of years when I was doing evangelistic work in New England in the United States, where it was a very secular part of the country. And he was a missiologist and a missionary, and he mentored me in that work. And then for the last 10 years, I was part of a theology group. We called ourselves the Christmas Theology Circle. We met every Christmas for 10 years, about 10 of us. And David and Grace would drive out from Indiana and be part of that circle to think through missiological issues for our time. And David's biography was published, a year or two ago, and it's called A Gentle Boldness. And that really captures how I believe Christians should be conducting ourselves in this time of polarization. David was a passionately committed evangelical Christian, always ready to share the love of Jesus with anybody. He wanted everyone to know about the way to God through Christ. And he had Muslim friends all over the world and co-authored with a Muslim author and presented jointly with Muslims and often spoke at Muslim universities who would have him in to talk about Jesus. I just think that is an extraordinary record of witness. And it was the gentleness with which he did that and the love that came through And a Bible passage that's really been important to me is 1 Peter 3:15. Always be prepared to give a defense for the hope that is in you, but do it with gentleness and reverence. So we Christians are to be known for our gentleness and also our boldness. And there are evils in our world we need to address. And there's also polarities. I got thinking about this topic of polarities just because it's all around us. Go to a family reunion and you'll probably feel it. On Tuesday, when I was this week, I was getting some notes together for this conversation, and I went to the New York Times, to which I subscribe. Probably says something about my political proclivities. But I just picked up a couple of headlines right off the front page. One was "Preaching Tolerance Abroad, Hatred Surges at Home." This is about anti-Semitism. We try to get, as a nation, we want people around the world to not be anti-Semitic, but anti-Semitism is on the rise in the United States with 3,600 reported incidents of assault or harassment last year. Another headline: a year after a school shooting, divisions run through Uvalde. And yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of that shooting. And the article is about how that community and the nation as a whole have become polarized over issues of gun control and violence. Another op-ed piece headline was "Trump is back to tear our families apart once more." Here we go again. There's going to be the Biden-Trump nastiness going on yet again. Another headline was "What Christian nationalism has done to my state and my faith is a sin." But you feel the polarization right there. So this is all around us, and it's in the secular world and it's in the religious world, and I think all denominations have experienced this recently. And I've been, throughout my working life, my ministry years, have had ecumenical contacts, settings where I was with Christians who were very different from me at times. And that would have been at Princeton Seminary as a student, Union Theological Seminary in Virginia as a student, mission work in Western Europe, very secular part of the world, then with Mennonite World Conference, working across, at times, people with from 58 countries. So the polarization that happens in the church is something that I've experienced ecumenically. And I'm reminded of a quote I came across, John Calvin, when I was a student at Princeton Seminary. John Calvin, whose theology set much of the course for what we call Reformed theology today. Calvin said, "Nothing could be prouder or more impudent than this donkey, Menno Simons." So he was speaking about the one of the early leaders of my denomination, calling him a donkey. I thought, well, Calvin's a pretty nasty guy. And then I read a little further and I came across a quote from Menno Simons, where he calls a fellow Anabaptist in the Reform movement a murderer of souls, a servant of the devil, a dunghill of a man. So this kind of nastiness is not something new, but something we should be addressing. So polarities, Kate, are all around us, and I think we all could tell our own stories of that.
Thank you. I think that's probably very true, especially for many of the pastors who are on the call today who preach about one thing and hear from both sides of their congregation about they either went too far or not far enough. I've heard a lot of pastors speak about that. So you made us well aware of the problem. Do you have a big solution for what feels like an overwhelming problem?
No, but God does. And I've taken hope from some of the passages in the writings of Paul that thematically sets the stage for the renewal of all things. It's not just Paul, but we see this even in the book of Revelation. But I would, Kate, I would point to Ephesians chapter 2, where Paul is talking about the tension between Gentile and Jew within the Christian church. And this was a tension for which he literally gave his life. He literally died in bridging across that and gave his life as a martyr. But he writes in Ephesians 2, but now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ, for he is our peace. In his flesh, he has made both groups into one and has broken down the dividing wall of hostility so that he might create in himself one new humanity. Okay, what I noticed there, and I noticed this in several passages in the New Testament, where the broad theme of unity is stated, that the cross and the suffering of Christ are right in the center of that. That there's a way in which this big vision for healing of the world is a costly thing. Another example of that would be from Colossians 1, where we have that beautiful hymn, Christological hymn, Christ is the image of the invisible God. This love of the Logos has now become visible. And then verse 19 of Colossians 1, for in him, Christ, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him, God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace through the blood of his cross. There again, you have the cross. And I would see that Jesus had this big vision for all things coming together, at least certainly the way the Apostle Paul presents the theology of and the meaning of Jesus. It's a cosmic vision of all things coming together. And it's for that reconciliation that Jesus dies on the cross. I think we too much personalize salvation. There, of course, is a personal aspect as we personally are regenerated, but God's design through Christ is to unite all things through Jesus and through the blood of his cross. And then the Apostle Paul has his own ministry of reconciliation for which he gives his life. And I could point also the big vision of Jesus on the night before he died, John 17. One of the last concerns that Jesus had before his death was that his followers would be one, that they would be united. And I would hasten to add that I don't hope for the homogenization of all denominations. I love the variety of the Christian church. The way the Black preachers and churches will do call and response preaching, the icons of the Eastern Orthodox Church, the wonderful liturgies of Catholicism and legacy of peace witness and reconciliation work among the Catholics, and on and on. And we Mennonites have our own contribution. All denominations have some unique gift that we bring to the global body of Christ. But somehow we need to find a way to really work toward the unity that Christ calls for. And I maybe would rephrase that to say it's not something we work for as much as something we recognize. This unity is God's work. It's Holy Spirit work. The unity of the church is a gift that God gives to us, and we need to recognize that and live into that gift that God has given us.
Thank you. That's really helpful. When I was reading your bio for everyone who may or may not know you well, I was struck by the work that you've been doing in Israel and Palestine. You just got back from being there for 8 months, and wondering, what polarization did you see there? How are folks in that setting working at that polarization, if at all?
Wow, that's a big question. Can I take about an hour to answer that?
Absolutely.
Well, I'll try to keep it brief here. Well, we're barely over jet lag from getting back from Bethlehem. We were on a volunteer assignment, went unsalaried we're both retired at this stage of life. And so I was teaching at Bethlehem Bible College in Bethlehem, of course, which is an evangelical school that also deeply cares about justice issues and is working on the kind of reconciliation things that we're talking about today. And my wife is a retired physical therapist, and she was doing volunteer work at a center in Bethlehem. The first thing I would want to say about Palestine is how wonderfully hospitable the Palestinian people are. And everywhere we went in the West Bank, we heard people say, "Welcome, we're glad you're here. Where are you from? Would you like some coffee, a little Arabic coffee?" We absolutely never felt in any danger unless it was from the Israeli soldiers. And that was the only time we ever saw big guns aimed at us. The West, and not in a hostile way, just at checkpoints and so forth. But it's one of the most polarized places on earth, very, very visible by that wall, that 400-mile-long wall that stretches between Israel and Palestine. And what you have there in the Middle East is two peoples who each bring their own story and experience of deep, deep wounding. And so you have the Jewish people with 2,000 years of anti-Semitism and pogroms very often orchestrated by Christians over the centuries, killing them or harassing them. And then the unimaginable horror of the Holocaust, which will be a trauma. That's a generational trauma that will go on generation after generation, just the memory and the fact of that. So you've got that deep wounding there, and the Jewish people's legitimate need for safety and a homeland. And I'm glad personally that Israel exists as a nation. And then you have the Palestinian people who, when Israel emerged as a nation, there were 750,000 Palestinians just pushed out of their homeland or terrorized out of their homeland. There was a massacre of Palestinians as the war started. And Palestinians just said, we got to get out of here until the war is over. So they took their keys with them. They locked their houses, took their keys so they could come back, and they were never allowed back. They never got back to their homeland. And if that were the extent of it, you'd say, well, maybe that's 75 years ago. Let that go. But you have the ongoing, excuse me, the ongoing injustice of Israeli settlers moving in and simply seizing Palestinian land. And so there's 144 Jewish towns, settlements, that have been forcibly put illegally, the international community says, put in Palestinian territory. And from our apartment in Bethlehem, we could look out the window, and the first hill we saw on the horizon was a settlement. And up there, the settlers have all the water they need, for example. In Bethlehem, we'd get water like 1 in 3 days. Up there, there's plenty of water and swimming pools and so forth. And so this injustice carries on. And one of the things that impressed me in terms of the polarity is that so often Jewish people and Palestinian people live their entire lives without ever having a meaningful conversation with the other. There's some thousands of Palestinians that go into Israel every day to work, and they work in the restaurants and do cleaning jobs and sometimes professional work. But there's not really meaningful conversation about what's your story. They don't really know each other's stories. They might know some facts, but they don't know the heart story of what a Jewish person experienced or what a Palestinian person has experienced. And so there are some Christians, including a Palestinian man in the small church we attended, Salim Munayer. Salim Munayer heads up an organization called Musalaha, which means reconciliation. And for 30 years, he has organized structured conversations between Palestinian Christians and Messianic Jews, that is, Jews who believe in Jesus. And those Messianic Jews, I think, would entirely be in Israel. And I believe the Palestinians mostly would come from Palestine. But I'm not sure how he's done it. I was never part of one of these, but I did interview him and learn to know Salim and enjoyed him as a very able theologian. But just establishing that conversation to get these people talking to each other, to hear the other's story. And to me, that is an important clue for how we deal with polarization in our society. That so often we in North America, in church and society, have become tribalized, is a word that some sociologists use. That is, we relate to people like ourselves. And now in the last generation or two with the internet, we're really able to work globally with people like ourselves. We can self-select our group from anywhere on the internet or from a website, or we can go to a church where everybody pretty much thinks like us. And that becomes dangerous. I think conflict is a necessary part of human existence, and conflict can really be good in a marriage or in a church. The conflict is when you're really dealing with the real issues, but it's how that conflict happens. Is it done with gentleness and reverence, as 1 Peter 3 says, or is it done with withdrawal and alienation and throwing epithets at each other? And conflict can really strengthen a church, for example, if, say, imagine the congregation is this circle within my hands, and the whole congregation is there. And on one side, there's a political position for the Second Amendment or whatever, access to guns. And over here, there's a political position saying we should not have access to guns. Okay, that's a divide across there. And then there might be an opinion up here in the group about, say, gay and lesbian people in the church. We should accept them or we should not, would be down the other side. Now, what I'm trying to sketch here is you can get conflict going this way, you can get conflict going this way, get conflict going this way, all across that circle. And as long as there's a conflict from many directions and it's done respectfully, that can actually bind a group together. What becomes dangerous is if the congregation or the society move into two groups, where over here there's a group of people that pretty much all think alike on all basic issues. You name it, we think alike. And over here is another group, and they all think alike. Then what you have is a civil war. Then you have a fracture in the church and or society that no longer is experiencing conflict as binding the group together. Does that make sense, Kate?
Yeah, sorry, I My unmuting did not work immediately. Yes, that makes a lot of sense. I think we often feel like conflict is something to be avoided, and that also means that we miss the opportunity to engage with each other in a meaningful way. So yeah, I think that's very helpful.
I think what we need sometimes is more conflict, not less.
Yeah.
And that is a kind of relaxing a little bit about needing to persuade the other and convince the other and make the other change. But a level of trust within a family or within a church or within a society where people feel free to say, this is how it looks to me, and know they're not going to just be rejected. And the other says, well, I disagree with that. But if we can lower the anxiety level a bit and the need to control a little bit, then we can have more conflict. And I mean, conflict can really be fun. It can really be energizing, to get contrasting ideas and hear each other. Yeah, you had a question coming, Kate.
Well, I also just say we create a real atmosphere of fragility, and we don't strengthen a community if we haven't figured out how to work at conflict.
That's right.
You're a biblical scholar. You were president of a seminary. Can you say more about how the Bible shapes your understanding of polarities?
Yeah, well, the Bible is the touchstone of all the theology, or at least I intend it to be, and find it just an inexhaustible source. I've studied it all these years, and I realize now I'm going to die before I really understand this library of books. There's just so much to know there. But I alluded to some New Testament passages about God uniting all things in Christ and Jesus' passion for the unity of the church. I'd maybe appeal a little bit to the Old Testament. I increasingly see polarities within the Bible, within the biblical canon. Let me give an example of that. At the end of the book of Ezra, we see that God's people have just returned from years of captivity in Babylon. And while the Jewish people were in Babylon, the theologians of Israel were trying to figure out what in the world went wrong. How did our monarchy and religious establishment come to such a catastrophic end in 586 BC, and starting a little bit before that? It was just an unimaginable disaster for the Jewish people. So these theologians are in Babylon and they're trying to figure this out. Well, what they do is they write a long history that it is the books of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. That whole sweep of historical books really is one edited work with different chapters. It's what scholars call the Deuteronomistic history. Well, the premise of the Deuteronomistic history, that long sequence of books, is we lost Jerusalem because we engaged in idolatry. And we did not keep covenant with Yahweh. We did not follow the instructions that Yahweh gave us. So as the Jews come back to Jerusalem, Ezra is sent as a scribe. He's maybe one of the guys who's helping to write this theology in Babylon, but he comes with this, set of books and Book of Deuteronomy and whatever, but specifically the law, the legal requirements of covenant to be God's people. And he learns that some of the Jewish men coming back to Jerusalem have married Canaanite women. They have wives from outside of Israel. And he says, look, the scriptures say we should not do this. This is wrong. And so the conservative perspective of really being a stickler about the law ends up resulting in the Jewish men of Jerusalem divorcing their Canaanite wives, sending these women away with their children. Okay, this is a pretty harsh end to the book of Ezra. And it's raining and they're shivering in the cold and they're divorcing their wives. And just kind of a miserable end to the book. Now, that would be what I would call sort of the traditionalist stance of the Old Testament. About the same time, apparently, two books appear in writing, which are stories of things that happened probably long before. One is the story of Ruth, and you know the story, but the essence of that is that a Moabite woman named Ruth gets married into a Bethlehem family, marries Boaz, and Ruth, the Moabite, becomes the great-grandmother of King David, and then, as Christians would know, the great-great-great-great-grandmother of Jesus. Okay, you would ask, if you were watching Ezra, divorcing the women of Israel, you'd say, but what about Ruth? Would you have sent her away? What would have happened? We wouldn't even have had King David if she hadn't become part of our faith, of our genealogy. And the other story, similar, is the story of Jonah. Jonah, that is set a few centuries later. Ruth is set during the time of the judges. The story of Jonah is set during the time of the monarchy, and when Assyria was the most feared and ferocious power in the Middle East. The Assyrians, when they came into Israel in the late 8th century and besieged the city of Lachish, they put back in their palace in Mesopotamia images of skinning alive the Jews that they captured. They would skin. I mean, these were known for horrible cruelty and horrible destruction. So Jonah is called to go to Nineveh, the capital of that empire, and tell them that God loves them. And he says, "You have got to be kidding. I am going the opposite direction. I am going to Tarshish." And you know the story of the big whale and big fish and all. It's a wonderful story. I'm not sure if it's parable or history. I don't know that, but it's true. It's a true story because it reveals something deep of God's love, even for the other. Now, the point I'm making about the biblical canon here is that you have both of these streams represented, I think, perhaps even chronologically simultaneously. That is, as Ezra was divorcing the wives, someone else was saying, what about Jonah? What about Ruth? Here's a counterpoint. And God, in God's wisdom, has incorporated both of these within our canon, and they are in tension with each other. And that's wonderful that they're within tension, because faith communities always are within tension. I think if there's no tension, we are a cult. We're just all thinking alike. We're just latched into one way of thinking. And that, to me, feels like a cult. Paul, at one point in his writing, refers to us as co-creators with God. We are God's co-creators. Well, that gives us some reason to think we are to be taking initiative. We are to participate in the discernment processes. And I believe we always do that in the light of the biblical tradition. To me, the first place to go in discerning ethical matters is Scripture. But I could name a number of other polarities. Let me throw in one yet from the New Testament. And that would be, I would make a polarity between Romans 13 and Revelation 13. Romans 13, you have Paul saying Government is God's servant. Government is there for your good. Keep your nose clean and you'll have no trouble. So Paul's talking about the Roman Empire there. He's talking, for heaven's sake, about Nero, Emperor Nero. He's there for your good. This, of course, was before Nero executed Paul, but he was still hopeful about the Roman Empire. Well, what you have then between Romans 13 and Revelation 13 is you have some history happens. And the history that happens is the destruction of Jerusalem after the Jews revolted, the terrible slaughter of God's people in Jerusalem in AD 70 and following. So the book of Revelation gets written after that catastrophe, after the Roman Empire killed Peter and Paul and a bunch of other Christians, after the Roman Empire became aware of the Christian church and actually started persecuting the church, and presumably after the Roman Empire put John of Patmos out on that island so he couldn't make any more trouble. John's going to come from a different historical context, just like Jews and Palestinians come from different historical contexts in Palestine today, just like all of us bring our own historical context. John is writing after that catastrophe, and for him, the Roman Empire is a beast that gets its power from Satan, and Christians should have nothing to do with it, no respect for that power. It's going to fall. It is vile. It is the harlot city that's fornicating with the kings of the world. That's right within our New Testament. So if we try to decide how do we as Christians respond to government, we can't just go to Romans 13 and say, well, right here it says obey and pay taxes and all. We have to say, are we in a context where our government is doing the work that God intends governments to do as described in Romans 13? Or has our government, whatever nation we live in, has that government become more like Revelation 13, beastly, and then we disobey and we stand up? And that requires discernment then among, not just individually. I come from the Anabaptist tradition where I believe pretty deeply that discernment cannot and should not be just an individual thing like that I get the prophetic word from God and read the Bible and this is the way it has to be. This is a group process. This is something that we do as a people to wait on the Spirit and be in prayer and read the scriptures together and read the times and then discern and move ahead.
Thank you. I'm going to just pause here a second and see if there are any questions from the group for Nelson. If you have a question about what he said so far, or if you had a chance to take a look at his book, glad for any questions that folks have in the moment.
This is Ann Weaver. I guess I'm wondering about discernment and yes, you're making a really marvelous case about Scripture often holds polarizing ideas about what to do. So how might groups discern how we should interpret or how we should lean into our current context and our current conflicts?
Thank you for that, Chaplain Ann. Yeah. I would point to a wonderful example of discernment in the New Testament that I think gives a model for how we can do this in many issues. And this is the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15. And I think it's hard for us to realize how volatile the issue of Gentiles coming into the Christian church was for the Jewish people. Because what that meant for a Jewish person was that his or her faith was now being marketed, as it were, at reduced rates. You don't have to be circumcised. You don't really have to do all these laws that we think are important. The important thing is that you believe and that you recognize Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. And for most Jews of the first century, Jesus did not remotely measure up to what they thought the Messiah would be. He had a completely different idea. So when the Apostle Paul and others start seeing that the Spirit of God has just burst beyond the bounds of Judaism, now we are baptizing Roman soldiers in Caesarea, Cornelius. I mean, how can that be? We're baptizing the occupying army. This just seemed vile to conservative Jews. And the Jerusalem leaders wisely call a consultation. And in my book, page 129, I lay out the steps that they took. And I'll just name those steps without much elaboration. First, the church leaders recognized there was growing tension within the church, so they named the problem. Then, secondly, the church creates a forum to hear all parties in the dispute. What they hear then is reports coming in from the field and different perspectives. They have hearings, as it were, for these life experiences to be part of the process. Then they tell their stories. Then there's adequate time to air convictions. It simply says in verse 7, there was much debate. I have an idea. There's a lot packed into those two words, much debate. I think they really argued. I think they slugged it out. And then someone proposes a way forward. One of the leaders says, I think I see a possible compromise. James says, my brothers and sisters, I have reached the decision that we should not trouble with circumcision those Gentiles who are turning to God, but we should write to them to abstain only from things polluted by idols and from fornication and from whatever has been strangled. So what he does is he takes some of the legal requirements, says we're going to keep those, but we're no longer going to require circumcision. It was kind of compromise stance. And then the participants in this forum ratify that decision. It says this was agreed upon with the consent of the whole church. Now, I don't think the consensus has to be unanimity. I think consensus should mean in the church, not that we all think alike, but that we're willing to move ahead. After my voice has been heard, I have had a chance to give my perspective, even if I don't agree with where the church or the society is going. I'm still part of this. This is still my home. And then the message gets reported out across the church. This is what was decided. But Ann, I think those basic steps are really good process. And I spell out some examples of, I think it's the Presbyterians have really fleshed that kind of thing out. I don't know if they use Act 15 in their description, but there are good processes that Christians of various denominations have developed for making sure that everybody's heard. I think when there's conflict, one of the frustrations and one of the things that keeps agitating the conflict is that people feel like they haven't been heard or they feel like they're misunderstood. And in the conflict work I've done over the years, I've discovered if you can get people in conflict or in conflict to really, truly listen to the other and communicate to the other that they have heard it. And that is a huge help. You're halfway through the battle if you can do that. And one of the ways to ensure that that happens is to have one side in a conflict speak, not making accusations, but talking about themselves. You know, the I messages, I experience it this way. This is the way it feels to me. This is my understanding of the Bible or whatever. And then have someone from the other side, as it were, summarize what that person said. And they have to summarize it until they get it right. And maybe the first speaker will say, no, you still don't get it. You don't see what, and so you say it again. But once the other party registers and reflects that they understand the position, even if they don't agree with the other's position, they understand the position, you're at least halfway through the healing process.
We have a question from Peggy in the chat. I have attempted to get people to discuss difficult topics. I use Proverbs 27:17, iron sharpens iron. I have the understanding this means as Christians, we are working out, discussing difficult ideas to strengthen our faith as well as strengthen our witness to the world. Your idea is initiating and working through this.
Stephen Covey talks about the speed of trust, which I think is a marvelous term. Speed of trust, what I take him to mean by that is it's possible for a group, or say leaders in a group, to move so fast that they get out in front of the whole pilgrim band that they're giving leadership to, and they get far enough out there that they are mistaken for a foe coming the other way. You can also put that in military terms, but I like the pilgrim image better. That in dealing with controverted issues, there is a matter of timing. And let me give an example of that from Mennonite World Conference. I was chair for 7 years of Mennonite World Conference, reaching into 58 countries around the world. I should emphasize I was never staff. I never was paid by the organization. I was volunteer, elected chair of the governing board. So I was doing governance kind of work, but got involved fairly often in a little bit more grassroots kind of activity with the organization. And we decided, some of us from the West decided, wouldn't it be really good to have a way that Mennonites around the world could discuss controversial issues? So we developed this, I wasn't part of this, but some very thoughtful conflict resolution people from the West developed a nice format for the way we wouldn't try to decide anything when we discuss these. We'd just be trying to understand each other, which is what I've been saying in the last 10 minutes. We're just going to try to understand each other. And we're going to look at Bible, we're going to look at life experience, and let that be an enriching experience. Well, this proposal for dealing with controversial issues came before the whole global body of delegates, what about 100 of us or 120 of us from around the world. And the people in the North, in Europe and Canada and the United States, thought this was a great idea. This would really be rich. I tell you, in much of the global South, it was not popular. Some of the people in the global South said, "You mean we're going to talk about some of these issues? Really, what you want to talk about is LGBTQ issues. That's what you really are getting at. Are we going to talk about these and then not decide? We'd rather not talk about them at all." And I realized it was a speed of trust kind of issue. And some of the people in the global church, this is not just the Mennonite church, this is every denomination, are in countries where to even publicly show any support for gay and lesbian people can land you in prison. You can be sentenced for simply expressing support. Well, of course, the church in that part of the world is going to say, we don't even want to talk about this. I mean, it's simply too dangerous. And now that's looking on the global level, but I would say with congregations, leaders need to be careful to adjudicate and discern between what I would call the priestly function and the prophetic function. And church leaders often can't do both. I think of working as administrator at a seminary, there were controversial issues where that is theological issues in the wider church, where I would have had a personal stance that I might have said, I'm not going to just talk publicly about that. I'm not going to be dishonest about it, but I'm not going to just go on a limb and start talking about that because that would just cut me off from a whole sector of the church on one side or the other. But having said that, I think churches and societies need prophets. We need the gadflies. We need the people who are pushing the boundaries a bit, who are saying the way we've done everything, the way we believe it all, we need to rethink this. And then churches and societies also need, when churches, we need the priestly function, which I think of as more the administrative and liturgical function of keeping the organization going. I very often, I would say, found myself more in that role, in the more priestly role, and say at the seminary or at the World Conference, kind of dealing with the prophets who would come and want to push things, and really working at building relationships with all across the spectrum, as it were. I think leaders need that gift to not just identify with the prophetic or just identify with the priestly, but to spiritually and administratively function across that spectrum. Does that make sense, Peggy? I'd be interested in any response. I think you're muted still then.
You're still muted, Peggy.
There you go. Bottom left of your screen should be a little arrow if your screen looks like.
There you go.
Okay. Yeah, I hit it, but I didn't. I don't know. It wasn't good. So, I'm not a pastor, by the way, but and I've always, and kind of hit something with me too there, because when I've taken gifts discernment things, I've always hit high on the prophetic side. But I don't want to say that I'm a prophet, but anyway, I think being prophetic is sharing the word and I guess this thing of conversation. I feel this concept, like I need to bring people closer to the word, or at least discuss it with me so I have a better idea. And this is one of the things is I feel like people within my Sunday school class and stuff feel like they can't say, and I'm feeling this thing that you're saying is that I probably have pushed some people away because I have said, this is how I feel about something, in a biblical way. But I think they have biblical knowledge also, and so should be able to have that conversation. So I don't know how to get them to feel safe in that kind of situation.
Yeah.
Because I feel like there's these people who have ideas and strong opinions or ideas about don't share them. And then it causes conflict because we don't discuss them.
Yeah. The signal is a little bit garbled there. I'm not quite sure I captured that. But
I think.
Let me say something about curiosity, and I think it's relevant maybe to the question you asked. I would like to cultivate curiosity in my own life and encourage people within the church to cultivate curiosity. And I mean that as curiosity about the people who take stances that are really different from mine. And really try to understand what lies behind that. And, you know, I think maybe the kind of polarity that you're describing, Peggy, perhaps could be somewhat addressed by that. If people are ready to play the game, or if people are ready to enter into that, and they might not be. But if they're ready to be in a conversation, say in a Sunday school class, where they would agree that for the next 30 minutes, we are just, or whatever it is, we're just going to hear from one sort of position in the debate. And it's okay to ask questions of clarification, but it's not okay to start rebutting and coming back. And just simply working at that, listening and understanding the other's life story and their experience, might begin to heal things. Kate, can you pick up at all with anything that I had a little trouble understanding, and I also have a little bit of hearing loss at my advanced age. So, yeah, but it was hard to understand.
I think you spoke to this in, to some degree at least. I think Peggy was also asking, how do you make people feel safe enough to express their opinion and have a conversation where the emotions probably aren't heightened from the start. And I think you spoke to that to some degree.
Yeah, I think if it's really a highly polarized situation, you might want a trained mediator to come in and do that work. But one of the things what I did in Western Europe on a couple of occasions was a really polarized congregation meet with each side independently first and say, what would you really like the other to know? Not accusations about them, but about your experience and your position, and helping that group to summarize what their concerns were and give them the confidence that when we got in the meeting with everybody, there would be a moderator there who would not let things get out of control and get people yelling at each other or whatever, but would ensure that each side listened to the other until the other got it, until they could repeat it and summarize it. Kate, I'm impressed with the way Jesus did that kind of polarity work. He did his ministry in an extraordinarily polarized society. It was a society so polarized that a generation after his ministry, it broke out into civil war and war against the Romans. I mean, this was kind of like lead up to the American Civil War or whatever. Whole society was just wound tight. And the big issue, apparently, was how do God's people, the Jews, relate to the occupying Roman army? And you had the Sadducees, who were total schmoozers. They were running the temple, and they were practically on the payroll of the empire, and they were doing a daily sacrifice on the emperor's behalf in the temple for the emperor. Okay, that was one extreme. And then the other end of the spectrum, you would have had the zealots, who were armed rebels, or you would have the Essenes, who withdrew into the desert and awaited the apocalypse or the eschaton, or like Waco, Texas kind of expectation. And then you have the whole spectrum in between of Pharisees and Herodians and the different subgroups that we know at least something about. And I think Jesus reached across that. For example, he healed the servant of Roman centurion. He related to some of the people in the Sanhedrin. Nicodemus came at night and was ready, and Jesus was ready to engage him in such a loving way that we get that wonderful verse, God so loved the world that he gave his only son. That's said to a member of the Sanhedrin. And then you also have within Jesus' discipleship group, you had a tax collector. I mean, tax collectors, they were the normalizers. They were the ones, fitting in with the empire. But you also had Simon the Zealot. We don't quite know. That's a little mysterious title. What does that actually mean? Was he one of the armed rebels? He might have been. Well, when Jesus is heading out to the Garden of Gethsemane, the disciples say, "Should we take a sword?" And I think they had 2 swords. Jesus said, "That's enough." Well, who was carrying the sword? Peter clearly had one, because Peter famously takes a whack at the high priest's servant, cuts off his ear. I'll bet the other one belonged to Simon the Zealot. Who would have been carrying the Zealots? Some of them carried an assassination knife in the small of their back so they could pull it out and off a Roman. So this spectrum of disciples is within Jesus' inner circle, and he's there modeling this breadth of grace and teaching and love for which he's ready to wash feet and give his life. Wow, that's an example that we could see a little bit more of in the church.
Thank you. In your book, I noted you cite social scientists and social science, as well as a lot of biblical passages and biblical stories. What contributions do you see social science making to this conversation?
Oh, there's been a number of books written in the last 10 years on polarization and conflict. One of the books that I found most useful was Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, I believe his name is spelled. The book is called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Religion and Politics. Good people are divided. It captures a lot right there. And also just with the phrase, the righteous mind, that what I find in the church, and he's not mostly writing about the church, he alludes to the church, he's writing about society, that I find that on some of the polarized issues, both sides can really be kind of Bible thumpers and say, the Bible says this, and this is what Jesus did, and this is what we have to do. There's kind of self-righteousness. And for heaven's sake, I can be pretty self-righteous sometimes. I battle this kind of sense of course I'm right because I've thought this all through. But Haidt, one of the insights from Haidt that I find useful is that all of us are shaped in our decision-making by what he calls intuition. He says, as we approach a moral choice, there often is an immediate response, internal response, that we can't quite define the source of liking it or not liking it. And he says this intuition is shaped by our family background, the church we've been a part of, whatever small group we function in, whether it's the coffee clutch or a small group at church, our spouses, also life experience, especially if you've had some kind of traumatic life experience, that's going to shape you. And Haidt says that as we approach a moral decision, and much of the debates in our society are cast along sort of moral categories, cast in moral categories. Haidt says that it's like a rider on an elephant. The elephant is our intuition. It's huge. It's kind of lumbering. Our intuition goes one direction or another. And then he says, our conscious minds, that's the rider on the elephant. That's the guy that thinks he's steering the elephant. But as we approach a moral choice, that elephant, that huge elephant, just starts to lean one way. And it's probably going to go that way. So most of the moral choices we make in life grow out of that deep sense of intuition, of a huge background of life experience and learning that we can't even quite define, but we might call it on a gut level. We just have a gut sense. This is wrong. This is right. This is just. This is unjust. And then Haidt goes a little bit further, and he describes what he calls the moral foundations of how people decide things. Let me see if I can give an example of that. He says some people decide things on the basis of whether it is caring for people or harming people. He calls that the care-harm foundation. Or others decide on a foundation of fairness or cheating. He has 5 or 6 of these. And it goes on down. The last one is liberty or oppression. And he says a lot of liberals in society really capitalize maybe on the care harm kind of thing. Or is this caring for people? Is it harming people? And conservatives might be more likely to deal with, say, the authority foundation, subversion foundation, or maybe the liberty oppression. And his point is not that liberals and conservatives all, come from the same foundations. In fact, he says all of us draw at one time or another from each of these different 5 foundations that he establishes. But most of us on a visceral level will draw primarily from 1 or 2. Those are the ones we really care about. And so you get a conflict in a church or society where some people's big preoccupation is liberty or something like that. And another person's big preoccupation is whether or not anybody's getting harmed. And we're drawing from different foundations that then we just kind of talk past each other because we don't see the depth of conviction and why the other person holds that stance. So this is where it's really valuable, I think, in say, a church conflict, to have opportunity for us to meet with and hear from the life story of someone who holds a different conviction from us. One of the chapters in my book has to do with the LGBTQ debate. And I was fascinated by a Mennonite theologian who, in loving and articulate and careful ways a generation ago, taught why Christians should not ever bless same-sex unions. And I still believe that that stance can be done with love and compassion and care. And then some years later, he just kind of fell silent on that issue. So I went to interview him, say, what happened? Well, this couple has a gay child, and this child came out as gay as an adult. And they saw the integrity of their child's life and spirituality, and the life experience just changed this man. And I would say I've seen the same thing happen, say, with the stance of divorce, the views toward divorce in, say, my own denomination, where when divorce happens to you, which fortunately has not been my experience. My wife of 50 years is across the room here, but when it happens in your family and it's people you love and know, you just take a different attitude toward it than when you didn't have that personal kind of experience. I'm rambling a bit, Kate. Bring me back on track here.
No, I think that's very helpful. I think often we assume that changing your mind can be a moral failure, or that there's not room for that. And I think you speak about that well. If you don't mind, I will ask you to share personally about times that you have failed to bridge polarities, and then if you could also give an example of a time that you have succeeded in bridging polarities.
You know, as I was writing this book, as I was doing the early work on it, it was the height of the pandemic, and we knew people who had died from COVID, and vaccines were out, and it just seemed very important to be careful and to be vaccinated. So I go to the dentist, and I sit down in the dentist chair for the hygienist to clean my teeth, and I've known her for 10 or 15 years. She's always cleaned my teeth. She's an evangelical Christian, lovely spirit, lovely woman. And so she's getting ready to clean my teeth. And I said, by the way, have you been vaccinated? and she kind of blanched and said, no, I have not. I said, I'm sorry, but I cannot be your patient. I want to get out of here as fast as I can. She said, well, you know, she was very gentle with me. She said, you know, my doctor, told me that it's not necessary. Well, you have a quack doctor, I told her. And then she said, but my next door neighbor is a cardiologist, and he didn't get vaccinated. And plus, I knew a man who was vaccinated and he still got COVID. And I said, that's not science. That's just anecdotal evidence. You know, that's the way the wacko cable news people do. You know, they give an anecdote and they make, summary statements out of it. That's not science. And I said, what kind of Christian witness is this? If Christians, think they can just keep working in society without, being protected themselves. So I left the doctor's office, and the people at the front desk were sitting there looking a little bit grave, and said they would send the records on to the next dentist and wished me well. And I got home and I thought, I'm glad I'm done with that dentist, but I'm not sure I did that polarity very well. And I talked to a Christian counselor, a friend of mine, about this. And his comment was, when we are blindsided, when we're surprised by some kind of confrontation like that, it can catch us off guard and we can act in ways that aren't appropriate. So he wasn't exactly giving me a pass, but he kind of helped me understand where and why that happened. But I realized that I had denigrated this woman's Christian faith, kind of implied that she was not a good Christian. I think that was just a wrong thing to do. I think I failed at that. And so I have to guard my tongue. I can be fairly quick with words and can give a comeback pretty fast. And that's something I need to watch, because I need to do it with gentleness and reverence, as First Peter says. Let's see, a time when I bridged polarities. Yeah, I would go way back to my second year at seminary in Princeton, New Jersey. I was in a sea of Reformed theology and other Christian theologies, had a wonderful time there. I've been accused at least once in my life of being a Menoterian because I studied for 7 years at Presbyterian seminaries and have high regard for the tradition. But I got to chapel one day there at the seminary, and the speaker was in military uniform, and I looked around, and like a lot of people in the auditorium and the congregation had military things on. Well, here's this pacifist coming in to hear a sermon from a military guy. Turns out it was Kermit, Major General Kermit Johnson, who was also an ordained Presbyterian minister with offices in the Pentagon. He was in charge of the global, at least the Army chaplaincy program, might have been from all three armed forces, I'm not sure which, but he was an important man. And he preached a sermon in which he made a reference that I felt denigrated pacifists, kind of dismissed pacifists as being irrelevant. So after the sermon, I went up front and shook hands with him and thanked him for being there and said, I really need to have a conversation with you before you leave campus today. We need to talk. He said, okay. We set a time, a couple hours later. So I went in the library and tried to quick read some books and prayed and trembled in my boots a little bit because I'm, in my early 20s. And I go to the meeting place and the Major General comes in with his wife and an attaché and two faculty members and the dean of the seminary and the president of the seminary. So they're all there. They're gonna see this happen. And I think I was too abrupt there. Maybe the story I'm telling here really is a credit to the colonel or to the Major General rather than to me. Because what happened was I decided the guy is going to give me 5 minutes of his time. He's a busy man. And I'm just going to cut to the chase. I'm going to get right to the heart of the matter. I said, on one side of your lapel jacket is the cross of Jesus Christ, suffering love. And on the other side are the medals of killing, the art of killing. Like, how do you put these together? Isn't this basically like early Christians thought they could put incense on the altar to Caesar and then also worship Jesus? How do you hold this together? Well, it's a longer story than I should take time for here, but he ended up giving me at least an hour. I think it was maybe an hour and 15 minutes. And what he said was, once he confirmed that I was not a reporter and that he was not going to write about an article about this and so forth, that I was actually a student. The dean confirmed that Kraybill is actually a student here. He said, I am struggling with those very questions. He said, I deal with that every day as I go into the Pentagon. I thought, yeah, right. But he was really struggling with that issue of how you hold together the teaching of Jesus with being in the military and being part of an imperial kind of force. And so we kind of debated back and forth, but it very quickly fell into brothers really listening to each other. And I credit the Major General for his graciousness to me and setting the tone where we could talk. And at the end of an hour and 15 minutes, his attaché was saying he had to go. And I said, can you pray? Can you pray for us? And so he prayed a prayer of blessing on me and on our respective ministry, and we went our separate ways. And what the really astonishing thing that made a long-term impact on me was 2 years later, it was reported in the church press that Major General Kermit Johnson left the Pentagon and basically joined the peace movement and spent the rest of his life teaching and thinking about nuclear arms. He never became like a complete pacifist the way I might idealize, but he wrote a couple of books, and I didn't really stay in touch with him. He died about 5 years ago. And I think given his change of heart, he wouldn't care if I was telling the story, because it's in my book now, after I promised I wasn't going to go writing about it, but he himself was writing about his change. So it's out there. What stuck in my mind, Kate, was to not go into a conflicted situation and assume that I know what the other person is thinking, that I have them pigeonholed and that's who they are. And that's very often, even if people present a facade of certainty, about how they put their position out there. Even if they do that, they may inside be struggling much more with their own conflict. And that's what was happening with the Major General. He was actually struggling with these issues. And I think we should all struggle a bit with these conflicted matters. We should not become so settled that there's no other possibility. My way of thinking, it's the only way. I believe we should take a stance on moral issues. I think it's right to do that. I want to see prophets in the church and clarity of leadership with gentleness and reverence, as Peter says.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent place for us to conclude. I think you have brought together really thoughtful ways of addressing something that I think is really difficult for congregations right now. Either pastors and church leaders feel like they preach, and as I mentioned at the beginning, hear from both sides of the congregation about how they failed in either choosing a message that the congregation doesn't agree with or didn't go far enough in pushing that message, or the congregation just avoids all conflict or connection around difficult discussions, and then slowly people fade away because they feel like there's not it's not a living and breathing congregation. It's just a very careful space. So I really appreciate your approach to this. I also would just suggest to folks on the call, if you're looking for a really helpful book to address this either in your congregation or for yourself, that you consider Stuck Together. Larry added the link in the chat if you are interested in finding out more about the book, and also it's available from Amazon and other booksellers if you're looking for it. One of the things I appreciate about the book is that there are good discussion questions at the end of each chapter. So if you're looking for a way for your church to start to think about and talk about these things, this book is a good way of folks really having concrete ways of approaching this and discussing it. So thanks to all of you. Thanks so much to Landis Communities for all that you do to bring these conversations together. Nelson, thank you so much for your time and energy around this conversation. And thanks to all of you who joined us today. Take good care.
Thanks, Nelson. Elaine says hi to you and Ellen.
Oh, hi, Rich. Gosh, Rich, yeah, I haven't seen Rich in person for many years. So we were in seminary together. Was that in New Jersey? That was in Virginia.
In Virginia, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Great to see you. Thank you so much.
So lovely to see you, and some other familiar faces there. What a handsome group. This is my handsome wife here. So, yeah.
Hi, Ellen.
45 years, not 50.
Oh, okay. But we've been in love for 50 years.
That's true.
Right? Yeah. Okay. God bless you all.
Thank you all.
Carry on in the reconciling work. Yeah.